For this lesson, we're going to be looking into the spline tool. It's one of the most powerful yet underutilized tools within Unreal Engine 4. So for this, I'm going to need to import a couple of extra assets. I'm going to be importing rail end, rail mid, and rail mouth, just to start with. For these, I will auto-generate collision for the time being. We'll see how it performs before assessing whether it's going to work or not. So we have three assets. Before going any further, I'm just going to quickly go into these and set some things up. First off, for each one, let's set the material to just be that simple metal. Next, I'm going to check out the actual collision mesh. Now this is definitely not going to do. So for this, I'm going to try generating high hull vertex collision. This is still not amazing, but it'll definitely do for the project. So in this instance, I just had to set the max hull vert up reasonably high to get something that was going to work. I mostly care about an object coming down towards this and then falling. So I'm going to save that, at which point I'm going to open up rail mid, check the collision, delete it. Let's try generating one for this as well. That'll work for us as well. So I'm going to hit save. And then I'm going to go into the last one. Oops, I forgot to set the material on this one. There we go. I'm going to go into rail mouth, which is just a slightly wider version of what we've already got. I'm going to punch up the verts, and I'm going to generate on this. Yep, that'll do nicely. I'm going to save. And now it's time for us to start generating the actual blueprint. Oops, and once again, same mistake. Simple metal has to be set. So I'm going to go to blueprints, and I'm going to start looking at how to use an actual construction script. So new blueprint class. Once again, it's going to be an actor, and I'm going to call this BP _ rail. So for BP rail, we're first going to be adding a new component, which will be a spline. So click on add component and type in the word spline. Now there are two options here. There's splines and spline meshes. Now a spline refers to a shape that is the actual line that you draw through the world, whereas a spline mesh refers to a single mesh that will be kind of bent to follow a line that's given to it. You give it a start position, an end position, and the directions, and it'll try and warp the mesh to its shape. So in this case we want to add a spline, but later down the track we'll be adding spline meshes programmatically. So I'm going to add a spline, and I'm going to set it to be the root component. And this is what you will see. Now for this initial work, I'm going to get this, and I'm going to drag this out to be slightly longer and make it 300 units long. This will make a little bit more sense in just a moment. I'm also going to right click on this and add a spline point here, where I grab and I'm going to drag this up. So we have kind of like a basic arch. So if you missed what I just did, I right clicked and I hit add spline point here. And this is the shape that you should have on screen. Should be reasonably straightforward. So I'm going to hit compile, save, and I'm going to go to my construction script. Now essentially what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go to my construction script and I'm going to run a for loop. Now this for loop is going to do something that is, it's going to look at this spline and it's going to calculate how many of these points there are in it. Now at the moment we have 3. And for every point that's in there, what we're going to do is iterate through and add a mesh that connects to the next point. Now what this means is that we don't want to count the last point because it doesn't have a point beyond it. So we actually want to do the length -1, which means if we're doing a for loop, we're not actually doing length -1, we're doing the number of points -2 because the index is 0, not 1. So we're counting from 0 instead of counting from 1, which means we get a reference to the spline, we get the number of points, at which point we subtract 2, and I set the last index in our for loop to be the number of points -2. Then, for each point, what I need to do is add a spline mesh component. Now for this spline mesh component, what I'm going to be doing is I'm going to be setting this to be the rail. For the time being, I'm going to set all of them to be the rail mid, but I'll work on some better behavior in a moment. So we have the initial spline mesh component. However, we need to go ahead and actually set the rest of this so that it correctly warps along the spline. Now this is where we start looking at the start and end. So I'm going to get this spline mesh and I'm going to drag off of it. I'm going to type in set start, and you'll see that we have a nice function called set start and end. And when we get this, it actually gives me a start position, start tangent, end position, and end tangent. And we need to set these to correspond with our actual mesh, which means what we need to do is, we can just give myself a little more room here. What we need to do is get the point on the spline that we're looking at, get its position and tangent, and then get the next point on the spline that we're looking at and get its position and tangent. So the nice way that we can do this is to actually get a reference to the spline, get point, and you'll see that we have a couple of things here. We have get location and tangent at spline point, and all I need to do is say at the point index, set that to be the start and the tangent. Now at the index +1, I'm going to duplicate that and reconnect the spline. At the index +1, I'm going to set that position and tangent. At which point, all I need to do is hit compile, save, and if I look in the viewport, you can see that it's actually getting this mesh and it's warping it along it. And if I was to hold down Alt while dragging this out, I'd be able to actually draw a bigger spline into the world. Now I'll show you that in the actual stage. So I'm going to get the rail, I'm going to drag it into here, at which point we see this. Now if I click on the spline ending here, I go to my translation widget, and I drag it to here, you can see that I'm actually able to kind of move along the spline. I can Alt drag to bring in new points, but I can essentially make some really interesting shapes that we can use to kind of feed the bumpers within the game. If I hit go, this is what we would see in this case. So I could set up some really cool stuff that if the ball kind of came into here, it would then roll through and then drop out and do whatever it wants. Now, to get this working well, we need to consider doing a couple of extra things. Now, the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to my construction script, and I'm going to look at this spline mesh component, and what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to do a quick check. And what this quick check is going to do is it's going to see if the piece that's there is also the index 0. So I'm going to see if the current index is the index 0. And the reason I'm going to do that is because if it is the index 0, I actually want to set the scale to be a different mesh. So we can have an intro piece, and we can also do the same thing with an outro piece. So we can set the static mesh according to whether it's the first position, the last position, or if it's the mid position. So I'm going to get this spline mesh component, and I'm going to add a simple branch. I'm going to open these up and just pull them down a bit. And all I'm going to do here is, my first condition is checking if it's the first piece. So it's going to be saying, is this index equal to 0? Now if that's true, what we want to do is set the static mesh for this. Space that out just a little bit. We're going to set the static mesh for this and then continue with what we would normally do. And the static mesh is going to be equal, I'm going to promote this to a variable, rail start mesh. And I'm going to set this to be the rail mouth. Now, if this is false, let's then check to see if it's the end piece. And if it's the end piece, we'll do an operation on it as well. So, how do we check if it's the end? That's simple. All we need to do is check if this index is equal to the very last piece that it's going to check through, which is equal to that. At which point, I'm going to duplicate my branch. I'm going to connect this to here. And if this is false, I'm going to set the static mesh. So I'm just going to duplicate this. If that's true, I'm going to set the static mesh of this component to be equal to, it's getting a little bit messy, I should really clean this up. Just going to add a reroute note there and kind of connect it that way. And if this is true, what we want to do is promote this to a variable, and this is going to be called rail end mesh. Compile. I'm going to set this to be rail end. And if that's true, we're going to go straight on through and connect that. And the last piece that I'm going to do is if this is then false, we're going to set the static mesh to be equal to the general mid piece. So set static mesh. We're going to set the mesh of this target, so that's hooked up. So if that's false, this will then connect through to here. And I'm going to promote this to a variable, which is just going to be called rail mid mesh. Compile, save. And if I look in the viewport now, you can see that the end has this shape. So if I look at what we've got here, oh, I missed a piece. I'm going to go back to my construction script, and I'm going to set the default variable for the rail mid mesh. Compile, save. And if I look at this in the world, I'm going to go into unlit so you can see it a bit better. You can see that this opening has that wide section that we had created for that first mesh, and that the end section now has this cap on it, which means if I wanted to, I could actually have this up here and the ball would still fall out. Which would be some nice behavior, because it would go and then drop. So that's the first section, but let's actually get this working a little bit nicer. There are going to be two extra little features that I'm going to add. The first is that if it's the rail start mesh, I want to have the ability to set a custom scale for the mouth of it. So to do that, all I need to do is get a reference to the current mesh component that we're looking at, which I can get from here. So I'm going to get this, and I'm going to set scale, and I'm going to set the start scale if it is the start mesh. So I'm going to plug that in and plug this into here. Now since that's quite messy, I'm just going to add a reroute node, pull it up and over, and all I'm going to do here is I'm going to split this pin because it's looking for an X and a Y, but realistically I only really care about making it wider. I don't really want to make it taller as well, just wider. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to split that, and I'm going to create a variable. So right click, promote to variable, and this is going to be called initial scale, and the default value here is going to be 1. Now the next thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set all of these variables that we've created to be editable. The reason for that is that by making them editable, I can now modify them from the default properties over here. So let's have a look at what happens when I change these. If I set initial scale to 2, we now create a much wider initial section for the rail to potentially fall into. Sorry, for the ball to potentially fall into. So the ball's going to hit that, and then eventually it's going to get funneled into the rest of it. Now the other cool feature about this is if I go to my assets, and I were to get some of these other assets, such as plastic ramp and plastic ramp end, as well as general ramp. So I'm just going to import all with default setting. Now with these meshes imported, the reason this is super useful is that if I wanted to, I could set these, just type in the word ramp, and I could set this to be the plastic ramp normal, at which point we've got this. Or I could set it to be the version of it that has, type in the word ramp, so I can see them all. I could set this to be the no top version. And then I could set the mid pieces or the end piece to be their own thing as well. So if I go to here, ramp, I could then set this to be no top, at which point we end up with this nice thing where the ball could roll in and then fall through, and it looks like it actually belongs on the stage. And it's something that we can easily then just expand on and modify and do all sorts of weird and wonderful things with it. So again, I could just click there, I can alt drag, and we can have some interesting setups, which is nice. All I need to do to really complete this feature is to set the materials on each of these three things, which I'm going to do very quickly, and set the collision for them. So by default, if I want to look at these, I'm going to quickly check out the collision, which I can see is wrong. I actually don't care about the collision on the top, so what I'm going to do is, for the time being, I'm going to disable collision on the top, and then I'm going to go collision and generate. Actually, I might just try 16. It'll probably be fine on this mesh. Apply, which will generate that. I'm going to re-enable collision. At which point I'm just going to quickly set the materials for each of these things. I'm going to set the roof to be white. I'm going to set the body to be yellow. Save. And then I'm going to quickly run through and do that on the other meshes too. This can just be yellow as its general color. The other thing that I'm going to need to do again is check the collision. It's definitely wrong. I'm going to just do an auto generate of 16 as well. I'm going to save. And finally, I'm going to go for the ramp end, which is this one. Oops. Should be yellow. You should be white. Show my collision. Going to delete that. And the one I want to get rid of is this one for the time being. Apply. And now you can see that we're going to have something that'll drop straight through. And we should be all set up. So the last thing that's super important when you set this up, that's very easy to miss, is go add spline mesh component. And I want you to go down here and look for the word collision, because by default collision presets are no collision. Instead I'm going to set this to block all. Compile, save. Now when we want to test this at the end, I'm just going to drag in a ball so that we don't actually have to do any extra testing. I'm going to get this, going to drop a ball there so you can see what happens from the get-go. But you can see that the ball rolls in, falls through, and it's all set up. Nice little thing. So this can be used all across the board if you want to create walkways in your map, if you want to create all sorts of interesting things. It could be piping throughout the environment that you don't want to have to custom model and instead put in the hands of the level artist. There's plenty of times that this is going to be very useful. So always keep in mind that it's something that's very easy to create and leverage from.